It was just about time for my fourth post-dinner coffee when Watley, useless colleague that he was, slithered up to the edge of my cubicle. I heard the call come over the wire earlier. Watley and his partner Donahue, who was out sick this week, found it on their laps. The report was for a lone homicide. It was quiet this month, so I dipped back into some old murder books. I was knocking on doors all week pursuing an ongoing conveyor belt of dead ends, quite literally, and was starting to regret deciding on the case that I chose. So the sight of pit-stained Watley this time at least was more than welcomed. But he seemed off. Watley was normally 300 pounds of a complete idiot in a 5-pound bag. Not now though. His shoulders were up. His eyes were uneasy, and his voice lacked any authority. Watley asked if I was free to come sit in on his perp, maybe pipe in if I felt any leads. I mean, why not? The cold case was frozen shut, and the rest of my night was empty. I joined Watley and asked him for the attending officer's report. I quickly scanned it. Homicide at a wake. That's a new one. Watley handed me another file, this one for the perp. I opened the file and found myself staring at the headshot of a man whose eyes saw right through me. They were hypnotic. Even in black and white, they radiated and made you feel like someone was on the other side of the photograph. I had seen all kinds of eyes on the streets. Eyes of soldiers back from the Middle East, hollow and distant, like they stayed overseas and never returned with the body to which they were attached. I had seen eyes of crackheads, criminals, and even worse than that, I had seen the eyes of dead people and animals. But this man's eyes were black holes, like they contained all the death that I had ever seen and more. I felt a chill up my back. His name was William Calder. He had immigrated here 5 years ago. He's 64 years old, though looked to be in his early 50s at the most. Occupation is... I stopped reading. What the heck? I handed the file back to Watley, my thumb under the words. He eyed them, knowing what I must be thinking. Watley shrugged sheepishly. My eyes drifted back to the report. Calder's occupation was listed as Sin Eater. That was also a new one. Apparently Calder hadn't requested a lawyer and said that he would be representing himself, if need be. This man keeps getting more interesting. Watley was waiting for me to finish. I closed the file and he nervously fixed his glasses before we entered. Calder sat confidently, hands clasped together on his lap. He had a shaved head and pale, almost translucent skin. His eyes in person made you wish that you were looking at his picture and not the living, breathing human before you. He didn't blink. No wonder Watley couldn't handle this guy. Even I felt my hackles go up. I introduced myself, as did he, and I could detect a slight Scottish tinge, but it seemed to have layers of other accents over it, of which I could not identify. I started in, asking him to explain what he was doing at the wake and his relation to the family. He spoke perfectly. Each sentence came out fluidly, with no pauses or ums or ahs. Calder knew the family, the Finnegans, because he had been hired on by them to provide posthumous services to the deceased. I inquired what exactly that meant, and the circus began. Calder explained that as a sin eater, he would cleanse the dead of their mortal sins before they passed over to the afterlife. This was done to avoid hell or worse, wander the earth as a lost spirit. Typically, this was done at the funeral, with food and drink being passed over the body, symbolizing the absorption of the sin. The food and drink would all be consumed by the sin eater, who would bear the sins of the deceased after performing a short prayer that would contain the transgressions to himself. Judging by Calder's lavish dress, he appeared to be handsomely rewarded. He knew the game and he conned it well. The Finnegans wanted the patriarch of the family to be absolved sooner than the funeral, and with good reason. Secrets about the grandfather had come out. He was dangerous and responsible for domestic atrocities the family didn't want to elaborate on, or to allow to come to light. I asked Calder what sins the grandfather had carried, but he refused to answer, claiming that although he had been excommunicated by the Roman Catholics, he still had his oath of confidentiality to those who confessed, living or dead. I asked why he had been excommunicated, and he said priests were supposed to administer the last rites to the dying, and what Calder did ran counter to that territory. It all sounded like the ramblings of a crackhead, but he wasn't a crackhead. Not like one that I had met. Calder spoke too well, too perfectly concise. The things he said were confusing, but they somehow made sense. He still hadn't blinked. I'm not up to date on my Bible jibber-jabber, but I knew Watley was. I could see that his knee was trembling under the table. I asked him if he could grab Calder some water, and Watley laughed happily. It was just me and Mr. Sin Eater now. I asked him how someone comes to be in his occupation. Calder spoke of studying in monasteries and temples. He had lived for over a decade in the Yerba Valley in Tibet, where he was engaged in the practice of incarnation and the transmigration of spirits. He became a practitioner of sky burials. He went on to explain the area that he lived in Tibet. There was no soil or dirt or trees on these stony mountains. You couldn't dig a grave or cut down wood to burn in a cremation. So they would take the body to the highest peak and disassemble it to decompose while being exposed to the elements. It sounded a lot like they chopped up their family or friends' bodies and left the pieces to be picked apart by vultures, but hey, what do us Westerners know anyway? Back to the reality of the situation. Mr. Calder had killed a 17-year-old boy at the boy's grandfather's wake. I asked him what had happened to cause that. For me to understand, I would have to be a different man with vastly different experiences, explained Calder. I responded that the judge would be less willing to hear what he had said than I was. He said that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was 3 gentlemen would be arrived in the lobby any minute. And it was in ours, both mine, the precinct, and the neighborhood's best interest to allow them into the room. I told him if the 3 men showed up asking for him to be released, they would be joining him in a cell momentarily. He responded that no, they wouldn't, because what was happening was beyond my control, and the longer I prevented the final act of the ritual, the more danger it was for Calder, me, and everyone around us. He elaborated further. The boy at the wake, a distant teenage cousin, had eaten some of the bread that passed over the deceased grandfather's body. The sins collected in all parts of the food and drink festered conjointly and passed into the teen. Concentrated together, the sins would overtake the boy and he would become violent and attack those around him. Calder had seen it happen before, many times actually, and took it upon himself to not allow it to occur again. He used a butter knife and he took care of the boy, but he hadn't been able to finish the ritual because of the obvious and ensuing panic. And at that moment, Wally entered and motioned for me to step out for a word. I joined him in the hallway, and there were 3 men in the lobby. A rabbi, a priest, and an imam arrived a few minutes ago, and they were demanding to see William Calder. A rabbi, a priest, and an imam. That's gotta be the start of a joke, right? They all walk into a bar or something, but not a police station. I told Wiley to put them on ice and that this was an active investigation, and unless they were his lawyers, they had 0 standing here. I went back in and I joined Calder. He knew that the 3 men were here, and again urged me to let them in. I didn't believe anything that he said and I let him know it, but I gave him credit for the creativity. I wanted to know more about the boy, if Calder had known him previously, if there was a grudge or any historical motivation. But Calder didn't, and there wasn't any. He steered back to me, permitting the 3 men to enter, stating how dangerous it was getting. Was that a threat? Sweat perspired on Calder's forehead, his temples, his neck and scalp. He was shiny with it. He started to blink, repeatedly now. Were his eyes changing colors? The whites had gone bloodshot, all within a matter of seconds. He put his now glistening hands on the middle table, his face twitching and his body was trembling. He spoke, now in a deeper, thicker voice. If I didn't let the men in, I would die in here. Calder's eyes were sinking back into his skull, and I saw small wafts of black smoke drifting from his mouth. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. The door burst open and I watched as 3 men had entered, the rabbi, the priest, and the imam. Wally stood by the door, watching covertly. Just as the 3 men got to Calder, I saw his eyes disappear into the back of his head. His mouth opened wide, and thick black smoke billowed out of it, pluming like a nuclear explosion, filling the room. Within seconds, I couldn't see anything. I felt the smoke envelop me, seep into my core. There was screaming, pain, and hatred. A festering horde of abominations collected in my lungs and chest. Anger boiled inside like I had never felt. And then I heard chanting. 3 sets of voices in separate languages that came together, forming what sounded like a prayer. They boomed over the screams that I heard in the smoke. Then all of a sudden, the anger and hatred that I felt began to fade away. It was easier to breathe. My vision became more clear. I realized that I had crawled over to the wall beside the door. As the smoke disappeared, I saw the 3 holy men standing over Calder. He was hunched over in his chair, heaving. The smoke was draining out of the room and up into Calder's nose and mouth. Low groans and coughs emitted from him, and the last of it emptied. The men then helped Calder up and carried him to the door. As they walked past me, Calder looked down, locking eyes with me. Images flashed through my mind. They were things that I had done. Falsifying information to get convictions, planting evidence, accepting bribes, beating the crap out of the people that I arrested. Even the man that I had gotten away with killing last year. The one who beat my murder rap because my old partner had messed up the paperwork. And then there was that girl from my rookie year. And there was more, so much more. Somehow I knew Calder saw it all. He leaned down and put something in my hand. I was still in shock and I couldn't move, but I felt it there. And then Calder and the 3 men were gone. Wiley came in moments later, nervously, like the place was filled with toxic gas. Garcia, the staff sergeant, was behind him. I felt tingling in my fingers and toes again. My joints started to come back to me. Watley and Garcia helped me up and back to my desk. They were talking over me, though I could barely understand them. Apparently, the footage from the interrogation room with Calder came back fuzzy, and the audio was incoherent. My hand was in a fist, but I could feel there was paper inside of it, balled up now. I opened my palm and flattened the small, rectangular paper that William Calder had given me. It was his business card.